In 12th March 1941, Berlin, Germany. The rain in Berlin had a way of sounding like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, never quite fading. It fell against the tall embassy windows that night, tracing long, trembling lines of water across the glass. Inside, the Irish flag hung beside the German, both limp from the heavy air of cigarette smoke and polite deceit. Major Thomas Kavanagh stood before the mirror in his small embassy flat, fastening his tie with a steady hand that only looked steady. The face staring back at him was calm, professional, the face of a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to hide what he thought. His uniform was spotless, his shoes shone with dull precision. He looked every inch the loyal military attaché of a neutral nation. But beneath the mirror, on the desk littered with embassy forms, sat a small black notebook bound in plain leather. It held no name, no insignia, only page after page of handwritten observations. Every entry was dated, coded, and written in his tight, controlled script. March 10th, General Dietrich observed at Hotel Adlon with SS liaison, drank heavily, complained about shortages on the Eastern Front, possible morale decay. Kavanagh snapped the book shut. In another hour it would be sealed inside a diplomatic pouch bound for Dublin, and from there passed quietly into the hands of British intelligence in London. Neutrality was Ireland's official position, but neutrality, he thought, was just another word for silence. He took his hat and coat, glanced once more at the quiet street outside, and stepped into the Berlin night. The reception at the Irish embassy was small but elegant. A handful of German officers, a few attachés from Spain and Sweden, and 2 men from the Gestapo who smiled like wolves in evening wear. Kavanagh circulated the room with measured ease, glass in hand, nodding and laughing when required. His job was to be invisible, to appear harmless, disinterested, the polite face of Ireland's distance from war. But every conversation was a battlefield. When a Luftwaffe colonel mentioned the inevitable victory over the Russians, Kavanagh laughed softly, pretending to agree, even as his mind filed the man's tone, his pallor, the tremor in his voice when he spoke of fuel shortages. When a Gestapo major asked about Ireland's curious affection for England, Kavanagh deflected with charm. "We're a small island, Major. We've learned that affection is dangerous, but curiosity keeps us alive." The Gestapo man smiled too long. Kavanagh's heart gave one hard thump, then steadied. It was always like this. A single wrong word could unmask years of work. After midnight, when the guests had left and the rain had turned to mist, Kavanagh retreated to his study. He removed his jacket, loosened his collar, and sat at his desk with the same notebook open under the faint yellow glow of the lamp. He wrote quietly, the scratch of the pen blending with the soft hum of the streetcars outside. Morale remains unstable, officers strained, Gestapo increasingly suspicious of Wehrmacht communications, internal rivalry widening, Hitler's behavior described as unpredictable by General Staff, evidence of nervous exhaustion. Each line was a risk, but each was also a weapon. He stopped once to listen. The building creaked. Someone moved in the corridor beyond his door. Slow, heavy steps. He waited. A knock. "Major Kavanagh, it's Müller." Relief flickered through him. The embassy night clerk. "Yes, come in," he said evenly. Müller stepped inside, pale and damp from the rain. He held a small brown envelope in his hands. "From the courier at the Swiss embassy," he whispered. "Said it was for your eyes only." Kavanagh took it. Inside was a single typed sheet, unsigned. Gestapo suspect irregular communications in diplomatic traffic. Inspection teams may be dispatched. Destroy all evidence immediately. Kavanagh folded the paper, placed it into his notebook, and stared at the wall for a long time. They were closing in. He knew what it meant. The Germans had intercepted something, maybe a phrase, a code, a careless repetition in his reports. Whatever it was, the walls of Berlin were listening now. The following day, he attended a luncheon at the Reich ministry. Everything about it was perfect. The white linen, the golden cutlery, the officers laughing over cognac. But beneath the laughter was tension, like a wire stretched too tight. A Gestapo captain named Weber sat opposite him. His blue eyes never blinked long enough. "So, Major," Weber said, slicing into his steak, "I hear Ireland has a fine tradition of poets. You must enjoy words." Kavanagh smiled. "I prefer numbers, Captain. Words can be too easily misunderstood." Weber chuckled. "Indeed, and you, my dear Major, are a man we hope never to misunderstand." For a moment, silence hung between them. Weber's knife scraped the plate. Kavanagh raised his glass, took a calm sip, and felt the cold sweat slide down his back. The Gestapo knew, or they suspected. Either way, it meant the clock was ticking. That night, he went to the basement of the embassy where the furnace burned quietly. He took the black notebook, tore out every page that mentioned names, and fed them one by one to the fire. He watched the paper curl, blacken, and vanish. Each page was a life's worth of secrets, and every one of them could hang him if found. When he was done, he hid what remained, the blank covers and 2 pages of coded summary, inside a false panel in his suitcase. He sat for a long time in the dim light, his reflection dancing in the furnace glass. He had never considered himself a spy. He was a soldier, a diplomat, a servant of a country that claimed to want peace while the world burned. But peace, he knew now, was not the same as safety. As the fire crackled low, he whispered quietly, perhaps to himself, perhaps to the ghosts of all those who had already vanished into the night. Neutrality is the prettiest lie we ever told. Outside, the bells of Berlin tolled midnight, and somewhere, deep in the corridors of the Gestapo headquarters, a file bearing his name was being opened for the first time. In 3rd April 1941, Berlin, Germany, the morning light crept weakly through the embassy curtains, grey and uncertain, like the conscience of the city itself. Major Thomas Kavanagh had not slept. The air in his small flat still smelled faintly of burned paper from the night before, the ashes of his reports, the ghosts of everything he had risked to send home. A knock came at the door, 3 precise raps, too firm for Miller, too polite for a Gestapo raid. Kavanagh opened it to find Captain Weber standing there. Same blue eyes, same unreadable smile. Behind him, 2 plainclothes men waited in the hall, motionless as shadows. "Major," Weber said, "we must speak, privately." Kavanagh gestured him in. "Of course, Captain. To what do I owe the honor?" Weber removed his gloves slowly. "I'll come to the point. There has been trouble. The Führer's office is concerned about leaks, confidential details, schedules, personnel, morale reports have somehow found their way into foreign hands." Kavanagh felt a single drop of sweat slide down his spine. "I see. And how does that concern me?" Weber's smile widened a little. "Berlin is a city full of diplomats, neutral countries, couriers. One never knows where a message might hide. The Reich would like your help, Major, as a friend of Germany, to assist us in finding the traitor." It was almost absurd. They wanted him to help find himself. By noon, Weber had installed himself at the Irish embassy twice a week. He called it routine cooperation. Kavanagh called it slow suffocation. Weber would stroll through the embassy offices with that quiet menace peculiar to Gestapo officers, polite, charming, but with eyes that noticed everything. He questioned the clerks, inspected mail logs, lingered near the communications room a bit too long, and always his gaze would return to Kavanagh. "Forgive me," Weber said once, "but you seem unusually calm for a man under scrutiny." Kavanagh smiled. A soldier learns that calm is cheaper than panic. Inside, he was far from calm. Every message he'd sent, every coded phrase, every courier who had carried his reports across Switzerland, all of it now hung over him like a silent noose. If one courier talked, if one pouch was opened, he was finished. So he adapted. If Weber wanted a neutral diplomat, Kavanagh would give him the best one Berlin had ever seen. He began to play the mirror game. At embassy dinners, he now spoke more warmly about German engineering, about discipline, about a Europe reborn. He took care to mention that Ireland admired Germany's resolve. He praised, toasted, flattered. He became what they expected, the charming, harmless Irish officer who admired their order and envied their strength. And yet, in small ways, he continued to send his messages, never written now, only spoken, hidden in harmless letters to Dublin. "The weather here remains heavy, the thunder does not break." Translation: morale worsening, officers near collapse. "The orchestra in Berlin plays louder each night." Translation: Luftwaffe bombings increasing. It was a delicate balance. One misstep, and his carefully crafted neutrality would crumble into ash. One evening, Weber invited him to the Adlon Hotel, the same gilded trap where Berlin's elite came to drink away the war. The chandeliers blazed like suns, the air thick with smoke and perfume. Weber ordered cognac and leaned close. "You have sharp eyes, Major. I think you could be useful to us, not just as a diplomat, but as a man who understands men." Kavanagh raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" Weber sipped, watching him. "The Irish are outsiders, observers. You see things we Germans overlook. There's a certain instability within the ranks, rivalries, petty jealousies. Perhaps you could help us assess loyalty." So that was it. They wanted him to spy for them. Kavanagh forced a faint smile. "If it helps maintain peace, Captain, I'll do what I can." Peace. The word tasted like poison. Over the next weeks, Weber grew almost friendly. He'd stop by the embassy to share rumors, to drink coffee, to ask Kavanagh's opinion on this general or that minister. Each visit left Kavanagh exhausted, his nerves stretched tight from pretending to be the man Weber believed him to be. Meanwhile, he gathered more than ever, whispers of shortages, shifts in command, the subtle panic seeping into the Reich's confidence, but the walls were closing in. One afternoon, as he returned from a meeting at the ministry, Kavanagh noticed a new face among the embassy guards, a silent man in a grey coat who didn't meet his eyes. He saw him again later outside the post office, again near his building at night. A tale. He had always expected one, but expecting and enduring were two different things. That night, he wrote only one sentence in his notebook before locking it away. "They have started to follow the ghost." A week later, a courier arrived from Dublin, a small, sealed pouch marked with the embassy's cipher. Inside was a single slip of paper. "London requests confirmation of morale report. Increase caution. You are compromised." The message froze him. Compromised. His first instinct was to run, to vanish into neutral Sweden or across Switzerland. But he couldn't. His presence in Berlin, his apparent cooperation, was the last thread keeping Ireland's intelligence link alive. So he stayed, and he lied. Each day became a performance. The neutral officer, the reluctant ally, the curious observer. He began feeding Weber harmless truths mixed with tiny falsehoods, making himself seem trustworthy while blinding the Gestapo to what really mattered. He spoke of rumors of sabotage in foreign embassies, of British influence in Swiss trade routes. Enough to make Weber believe he was doing his part. The mirror game had become his only weapon. But one night, the illusion nearly shattered. He returned home to find his flat door slightly open. Inside, everything was in place, except the drawer where he kept his notebooks. It was closed, but the papers beneath it were disturbed. Someone had searched. Kavanagh sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly, eyes on the door. He waited, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. He knew what it meant. They were almost certain now. Yet strangely he felt calm. Not the calm of safety, but of acceptance. The kind a man feels when he realizes the only way forward is straight through the fire. He would keep playing his role. He would keep lying to Weber, smiling at Gestapo dinners, pretending to believe in neutrality. Because every day he stayed alive was another day the world learned the truth about Hitler, Germany, and another day closer to the war, end. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, raised it toward the rain-slick window, and whispered softly, "To the mirror, and to the man it hides." Outside, Berlin glowed under blackout lights, a city of secrets devouring itself. And somewhere in the night, Captain Weber's men were already writing the report that would seal Thomas Kavanagh's fate. In 12th August 1941, Berlin, Germany. Rain fell over Berlin in fine, cold needles that night, a steady whisper against the embassy windows, like the city itself was trying to drown its sins in grey water. Major Thomas Kavanagh sat alone at his desk, staring at a single slip of paper. It bore the German eagle stamp, and beneath it, one sentence in Weber's neat handwriting. "We need to talk. Tonight." He knew what that meant. The mirror had finally cracked. He arrived at the Adlon Hotel just before midnight. The lobby was nearly empty, save for a piano murmuring softly in the corner. Weber was already there, sitting at their usual table, his cap on the chair beside him, a single glass of brandy untouched. "Major," Weber said quietly as Kavanagh sat down, "do you know what I admire about you?" Kavanagh smiled thinly. "Your persistence, perhaps." Weber's eyes didn't move. "No, your composure. You never sweat. You never tremble. It's remarkable." The silence stretched between them. Kavanagh felt every second like a ticking clock, counting down. Then Weber leaned forward. "Tell me, Major, why would a man like you, who believes in neutrality, spend so much time with the very men his government claims not to favor? Why would he attend briefings at the Reich Air Ministry or visit certain factories outside Tempelhof without notice?" He said it softly, like a friend asking about a debt. Kavanagh didn't move. He simply lifted his glass. "Because I'm a soldier, Captain. Observation is habit. Curiosity is survival." Weber studied him. Then he slid a small folder across the table. Inside were photographs, grainy shots of Kavanagh speaking to a Swiss diplomat, of his car parked near a restricted airfield, of his brief handshake with a courier outside the Tiergarten. Every image was a nail in his coffin. "I should arrest you now," Weber said, "but I'm not certain. My instincts say you're loyal. My orders say you're not." He stood, pacing. "Perhaps you can prove me wrong?" Kavanagh's throat went dry. "How?" Weber turned slowly. "Give me a name, just one. Someone in Berlin, British, Polish, maybe even Irish, who feeds London."
"You know people, you attend the same dinners, help me, and I will forget what I've seen." A name. One name to erase suspicion. It was a devil's bargain. And yet, in that instant, Kavanagh understood. He couldn't help the allies from a Gestapo cell. He needed time. "I'll see what I can find," Kavanagh said carefully, "but it must be someone credible, not gossip." Weber nodded. "You have 48 hours. Then he smiled, that quiet, reptilian smile. "After that, my friend, I cannot protect you." Back in his flat, Kavanagh poured a drink with shaking hands. The whiskey burned down his throat like acid.
He stared at his reflection in the rain-streaked window. Tired eyes, hollow cheeks, a man trapped between duty and death. One name. He thought of the faces he knew, the French attaché who whispered of resistance, the Polish courier who smuggled maps through diplomatic mail, the Danish secretary who coded British dispatches into opera programs. They were all risking their lives, just as he was. He couldn't betray them, but he also couldn't die yet. There was still work to do, and London still needed his reports. So he decided on another path. He would give Weber a ghost. The next evening, he crafted the lie. He wrote a letter to Dublin in cipher, telling them not to panic, that he was feeding the Germans false information under duress. Then in his notebook, he wrote the name Edward Blake. It was the name of a real man, an Irish shipping clerk who had died in London in 1939, before the war had even reached its fever pitch. A man who no longer existed, yet whose records still lingered in embassy archives. Kavanagh built Blake's story from the ground up, a neutral Irishman drawn into espionage by the British, operating from a small office in Alexanderplatz, gathering rumours for MI6. Enough detail to seem true, enough vagueness to make proof impossible, the perfect phantom. When he met Weber again 2 nights later, the air in the Adlon was thick with smoke and tension. Kavanagh handed over a folded paper. "You asked for a name?" Weber opened it, scanning the lines. His expression didn't change. "Edward Blake," he murmured, "Irish, shipping liaison." "Yes," Kavanagh said steadily. "He approached me months ago and he wanted my help passing small reports to London. I refused, but he kept asking. I think he's still active." Weber nodded slowly, memorizing every word. "And you are sure?" "As sure as I can be." The German took a long breath, then folded the paper. "If you are lying to me, Major, there will be no warning next time." Kavanagh met his gaze. "Then I'd best hope I'm not." For 3 days, Berlin buzzed with quiet hunts. Cars with covered lights moved through the streets at night. Men vanished from offices. Rumors spread through the embassies that the Gestapo had uncovered a new Allied network. Kavanagh said nothing. He went about his days attending meetings, smiling at luncheons, sending coded weather reports home. But inside, every heartbeat felt stolen. On the 4th night, Weber appeared again. He didn't smile. He didn't even sit. "It seems your information was correct," Weber said. "We found this, Mr. Blake. He tried to flee through the Friedrichstrasse station. He's dead now." Kavanagh's hand trembled just slightly as he lifted his drink. "Then I'm glad I could help." Weber studied him a moment longer. Then he said, almost softly, "You have bought yourself safety, Major, for now." And he left. When the door closed, Kavanagh sat in silence. The glass in his hand felt impossibly heavy. He had done it. He had survived. The Gestapo's eyes had turned elsewhere, but the victory felt hollow. He thought of the real Edward Blake, long dead, buried quietly in London, and of the nameless man the Gestapo had likely shot in his place, someone innocent who happened to fit the story. That was the price of survival. The Neutrality Lie had finally claimed its first life. Kavanagh poured the rest of his drink into the sink and whispered to the empty room, "Forgive me." Outside, Berlin thundered with the sound of distant guns. The war was growing louder, the lies deeper. And somewhere in the fog, Captain Weber was beginning to suspect that ghosts could bleed after all. In 5 November 1941, Smolensk, Eastern Front. Snow fell in slow, silent waves across the wreckage of the Eastern Front. White on black, ash on bone. The cold bit through wool and leather alike, and even the crows had stopped circling. The only sound was the low groan of trucks crawling east toward the endless frost. Major Thomas Kavanagh stood among them, the Irish tricolour pin on his lapel shining faintly against the grey. To anyone watching, he looked every bit the neutral observer, a foreign officer sent to inspect field conditions and report on humanitarian logistics. But Kavanagh knew better. This trip wasn't a courtesy. It was a test. And the man sent to judge him sat 2 seats away in the transport truck, Captain Ernst Weber of the Gestapo, silent as the grave. 2 weeks earlier, Weber had arrived at the Irish embassy unannounced. He was polite, smiling even as he handed Kavanagh a sealed order. "The Reich appreciates your continued cooperation, Major," he'd said, "but Berlin is full of talkers. The East, however, that's where loyalties are proven." It was phrased as a compliment. But Kavanagh had seen the glint in Weber's eyes. They weren't going to Smolensk to observe. They were going to measure him, to see how a neutral behaved when the world around him was stripped to bone and blood. The truck jolted through frozen mud. Kavanagh watched the landscape crawl by, shattered villages, burned fields, and half-buried shapes that had once been men. The air smelled of diesel and death. Weber broke the silence. "Do you believe in mercy, Major?" Kavanagh looked at him wary. "In what sense?" "In war." Weber's tone was calm, almost reflective. "My men say mercy is weakness, but weakness, I think, is lying to oneself. Don't you?" Kavanagh forced a small smile. "Sometimes lying to oneself is the only way to stay sane." Weber chuckled softly. "Then you must be very sane indeed." Kavanagh said nothing. They reached Smolensk near dusk, a broken city under a dying sky. The ruins of cathedrals loomed like skeletons, and the few civilians who remained moved like ghosts between fires and rubble. Their destination was a commandeered factory turned headquarters. Inside, German officers pored over maps, shouted orders, and smoked endlessly. Kavanagh was introduced as the Irish military attaché, guest of the Reich. He shook hands, smiled, and listened as they spoke of numbers, tonnage, fuel, manpower, all the while noting details for his next coded dispatch. The soldiers were cold, hungry, and tired of fighting ghosts in the snow. But beneath the exhaustion, Kavanagh saw something else. Fear. Even the victors feared this place. That night, Weber invited him to dine in the officers' mess. The table was heavy with grey bread, boiled potatoes, and the sharp sting of cheap schnapps. Around them, laughter rang too loud, men trying to drown their own dread. At the far end of the table, an SS major told a story about capturing Soviet partisans, peasants, and students, most barely old enough to hold rifles. He described their executions with theatrical flair, his audience roaring with laughter. Weber watched Kavanagh's reaction carefully. Kavanagh forced a chuckle, though his stomach churned. "War makes strange comedians," he said lightly. The SS major grinned. "You Irish have a stomach for dark humour, yes?" Kavanagh raised his glass. "We prefer it to dark fates." The laughter returned, the eyes moved away. But Weber's stayed on him, unblinking. Later that night, Weber entered Kavanagh's quarters without knocking. The lamplight cast his shadow long across the floor. "Walk with me," he said. They stepped into the cold. The moon hung low, a thin blade over the frozen ruins. Weber led him toward a trench behind the factory, a long pit lined with wooden posts. Kavanagh knew what it was before he saw the bodies. Inside, Soviet prisoners lay half-covered in frost, their uniforms torn, faces stiff with the last expression of disbelief. Weber stopped at the edge. "You wanted to see the reality of the East? Here it is." Kavanagh's breath formed white clouds. "Why show me this?" "Because," Weber said quietly, "Berlin believes in paperwork, but here we believe in truth. And I want to see how a man reacts to truth." He turned to face him. "Tell me, Major, when you report to your government, what will you say? That we are monsters, or that we are soldiers?" Kavanagh's heart pounded. This was the trap, the confession they wanted, the justification they needed. He looked into the pit again. The bodies didn't look like soldiers or monsters, just people, cold, silent, equal in death. Finally, he spoke. "I will say," he murmured, "that winter kills without needing orders." Weber's eyes narrowed, then softened. "A diplomat's answer," he smiled faintly. "You really are neutral." Kavanagh forced a breath of relief. "I try to be." "Good," Weber said, stepping closer, "because neutrality is the most dangerous position of all." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Kavanagh alone beside the pit. That night, Kavanagh couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the cracks, whispering in a language older than politics. He took out his small field journal and began to write. Enemy morale deteriorating rapidly, food shortages critical, executions increasing, command disputes between Wehrmacht and SS evident, Weber testing loyalties, believes neutrality equals control. He paused, staring at the page, then added, "Neutrality is death in disguise." He tore the page out and sealed it in a wax envelope coded for Dublin, destined for London. Then he sat in silence until dawn, the cold light crawling slowly through the frosted window. When the convoy departed Smolensk the next morning, Weber rode beside him again, gloved hands clasped neatly in his lap. "You handled yourself well," he said after a long silence. "I think Berlin will be reassured." Kavanagh gave a polite nod. "That's good to hear." Weber smiled slightly. "Yes, for both our sakes." As the trucks rumbled west, the snow thickened into white curtains, blurring the world beyond the windshield. For the first time, Kavanagh realized how completely he had disappeared inside his own lie. He was no longer sure if he was serving Ireland or simply surviving Germany. And somewhere deep inside, the ghost of the man he used to be whispered, "You can't stay neutral forever." In January 1942, Berlin, Germany. Berlin was dying quietly. Not from bombs or shells, not yet, but from the slow starvation of certainty. The streets were choked with snow, the people with fear, and the air itself seemed thinner, colder. Major Thomas Kavanagh felt it pressing against him as he walked up the marble steps of the Reich Ministry for Foreign Affairs. His breath misted in the freezing air, vanishing like smoke. He carried a slim leather briefcase, official documents, diplomatic letters, and, hidden beneath the lining, a final coded report. This was the last one he would ever send. 3 weeks had passed since his return from Smolensk. Weber had accompanied him back to Berlin, silent during the journey, polite but watchful. In the embassy, the Gestapo officer had even toasted to continued friendship between our nations. But Kavanagh knew the look behind the smile. He was being followed. Every courier, every coded message, every handshake, all of it now existed under the invisible shadow of suspicion. And yet, the work had to continue. Ireland's neutrality was a delicate fiction. Behind the curtain, Kavanagh's reports had become one of the Allies' most reliable sources on German morale, industrial strain, and even internal dissent. He had sent hundreds of pages, each written in invisible ink, each smuggled through diplomatic pouches marked confidential cultural exchange. But after Smolensk, the risk had doubled, and Weber's questions had grown sharper. At 8:30 that morning, Kavanagh sat in the embassy library waiting for his courier, a quiet clerk named O'Donnell, who had no idea the envelopes he carried were worth more than gold. The embassy was silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant hum of a typewriter. Then footsteps, 2 pairs, heavy, confident. Kavanagh's stomach turned before the door even opened. "Major," came Weber's voice. "Working early?" Kavanagh looked up slowly. The Gestapo captain stood in the doorway, flanked by another officer, tall, stone-faced, the kind who didn't speak unless it was to deliver bad news. "Habit," Kavanagh said evenly. "Diplomacy runs on punctuality." Weber smiled faintly. "And secrecy?" Kavanagh closed the briefcase. "That too." Weber gestured toward it. "Perhaps we might discuss that habit. I have received some questions about your recent communications." They led him not to Gestapo headquarters, but to a hotel's suite. Discreet, well-appointed, the sort of place where careers ended politely. Weber offered him tea. The other man stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Major," Weber began, "you've been a guest in our country for nearly 3 years. You've dined with our generals, toured our factories, even visited the front. The Reich values transparency, but—" He tilted his head. "There are those who wonder if perhaps your curiosity has limits." Kavanagh met his eyes. "You're asking if I'm a spy?" Weber smiled faintly. "I'm asking if you're a fool." The words hung in the air like frost. Kavanagh leaned back, forcing calm. "I represent a neutral government, Captain. My reports concern trade, morale, diplomacy. You've seen some of them yourself." "Yes," Weber said, standing. "But the question is, have we seen all of them?" He stepped closer, his boots clicking against the marble floor. "2 nights ago," Weber continued, "one of your diplomatic couriers was stopped for inspection near the border. Routine. Inside his pouch we found an empty envelope. Ordinary, except for one detail." He placed a thin sheet of paper on the table. The faint outline of handwriting shimmered beneath chemical stains. Invisible ink. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the man's watch by the window. Kavanagh stared at the paper, the ghost of his own handwriting. Weber's tone softened almost kindly. "You are an intelligent man, Major. I don't believe you're a traitor, but I do believe you've been used by the British, by the Americans. They've made you their messenger, hidden under your flag of neutrality." He paused. "If you tell me who receives your reports, I can make this go away." Kavanagh met his gaze. "And if I don't?" Weber's smile faded. "Then the embassy will receive a new attaché." There were 1,000 ways to die in Berlin. A man could vanish into an office, a cellar, a file marked unresolved. But Kavanagh had made a promise, not to London, not even to Dublin, but to the men who still fought in the dark, believing someone, somewhere, was listening. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he spoke. "You want the truth, Captain? Fine. My reports are sent to Dublin. From there, they go wherever they need to." Weber frowned. "That's not an answer."
"It's the only one I have." Silence stretched. Then Weber sighed, a sound almost of disappointment. "You should have taken the offer." He gestured to the other officer. "Search him." Kavanagh stood motionless as they opened his briefcase. Documents, a fountain pen, an old photograph of his wife, and beneath the lining, the folded sheet of onion skin paper he'd hidden there that morning. Weber picked it up carefully, turning it toward the light. "And what is this?"
Kavanagh hesitated, then smiled faintly. "A poem for my wife." Weber raised an eyebrow. "A poem?" "Yes, in Irish." Weber unfolded it. The text was indeed Gaelic, elegant, flowing script that to any German eye meant nothing. He read a line aloud, stumbling over the pronunciation. "Mo croi, mo dochas, mo shiochain." He looked at Kavanagh. "And what does it mean?" Kavanagh met his gaze, calm now, almost peaceful. "It means my heart, my hope, my peace." Weber studied him for a long moment. Then, to Kavanagh's quiet surprise, he handed the paper back. "I suppose even spies write love letters," Weber said softly. "You may go, Major." Kavanagh blinked. "Just like that?" Weber smiled, but his eyes were cold. "You'll be under watch. If I find another love letter, there won't be another conversation." That night, Kavanagh returned to the embassy. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat at his desk, staring at the blank paper before him. Then, slowly, he began to write in invisible ink once more, the same fluid, the same steady hand. But this time, he wrote something different. "Berlin suspects." Weber compromised, but cautious. "No further communications safe. Shutting down operation. Tell them the neutral has gone dark." He folded the page, sealed it inside a pouch marked "Cultural Report," and set it beside the door for collection. Then he sat back and exhaled, feeling for the first time in years both utterly empty and utterly free. Weeks later, that message would reach London through the Irish Channel. It would be the last one they ever received from Berlin. And when the war ended, no one knew what became of Major Thomas Kavanagh. Some said he died in the 1943 bombings, others claimed he escaped through Switzerland under a false name. But in an old, burned-out embassy file found years later, a single sheet of paper survived. Faint Gaelic words, still legible under ultraviolet light. "Mo croi, mo dochas, mo shiochain." My heart, my hope, my peace. And beneath it, a final line written in English, added later in a different hand. He never stopped being neutral. He just chose which truth to die for.